Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video. In this video I'll be starting a bit of a new series here, and for a while I've been wanting to play the Yakuza series, and here I'm going to be doing a series of videos similar to what I did with the Kingdom Hearts series, where I talk about my experience playing through the series from the very beginning. So here I will be talking about the first 3 games in the series that I have played, with those being Yakuza 0, which was a prequel to the series. We have Yakuza Kiwami, which was the remake of Yakuza 1. And we have Yakuza Kiwami 2, the remake of Yakuza 2. Now obviously this video will include spoilers for all these games, but before we jump into the games themselves, I might as well talk about my prior experience with the series as a whole, which isn't much. I mean, Yakuza is a series that I have always been interested in, largely because of its focus on narrative. Years ago, I did get around to playing a sliver of the original PS2 version of Yakuza, but never got too far into it. Then years down the road, a few years ago now, I did get to play Yakuza Kiwami for about 30 minutes or so. But again, I just stopped playing it, never really went back to it. But it was really more recently where I decided to give this series a legitimate shot, and that's when I finished playing through the Shenmue series. And with Yakuza obviously being a very similar game in terms of gameplay style, and also with every main series game being available on the PS4 now, I thought this was the right time to jump into it. So I did it. Now I did debate over whether to start with Yakuza 0 or Kiwami, as I have heard that 0 was a great starting point and one of the best in the series, while Kiwami was obviously the remake of the original game, but also heard it just wasn't that great of a remake. So I did end up deciding to start with Yakuza 0, which is the game that we're going to start talking about right now. And really, we should just start by talking about the gameplay, and really this will cover most of the games in the series. And from what I understand, the entire Kiryu saga here, so Yakuza 0 through 6, all play pretty much the same. I mean, they're all third-person action-adventure games that have a relatively small open world where you can do some wacky side quests, you can play some mini-games, you can play some arcade games, but really most of the games from a gameplay perspective just kind of blend together. I will say I do find it kind of funny how, through my experience of the series so far, they reuse so many locations. Like, namely, the area of Kamurocho is like the same primary location in all 3 games that I've played so far. It really largely remains unchanged throughout these games as well. Like, the layout is exactly the same, the buildings are all exactly the same. Obviously, graphically, they vary depending on what engine is being used, but I mean, it's pretty much the same location. A minor complaint that I did have with the open world here, though, was the inclusion of these rival gang members that will chase you, and if they catch up to you, you obviously have to fight them. And obviously, it's very similar to just standard random encounters from RPGs, and I just found it really annoying. I really just didn't feel like dealing with these really insignificant fights, and because of that, for me, I was more incentivized to use fast travel within the game so I could just avoid them. Though in Yakuza 0 here, fighting gang members do matter a lot more, as the progression system in this game requires you to use actual money to buy skills instead of your typical skill points, and you do obviously get money through defeating these gang members, so that did become a more important element of the game. Now let's talk about the combat system, which is your typical 3D beat 'em up, but something I did like from Yakuza 0 here was that there were 4 different styles that each character could use and change between in the middle of combat, with each of these styles feeling unique and having their own pros and cons. Kiryu had your more standard styles that you would expect, but Majima had some really ridiculous ones, like Slugger style being focused around using a baseball bat, and Breaker style being focused around breakdancing. But I will say that by the end of the game, I did find the combat as a whole to just be really annoying. It just got really, really repetitive, especially in the endgame stretches of the game, where you just go from fight to cutscene to fight to cutscene to fight to cutscene. Like, it just really got repetitive for me, and it got really, really draining. In terms of side content in this game, again, side quests, really wacky, really weird. Some of them are fun, but some of them are also just really pointless. And because of that, I rarely went out of my way to do them, but if I were to accidentally stumble upon one, I would just go ahead and do it. There are also side businesses in this game that the main protagonists run, and I hated these. I mean, they were just really dumb mini games. I really hated being forced to do them, as the game would force you to do it one time, obviously, before you can move on, and I just really didn't find them fun at all. But now let's talk about the game's narrative, which, as I said, Yakuza 0 is a prequel to the entire series, taking place in 1988, 17 years before the main events of the first game. And the story here, I will admit, took me a while to get into. And I was pretty surprised by this because, again, I hear from so many people that Yakuza 0 is one of the strongest narratives in the series. And while I did find it to easily be the most complex of the 3 games I've played so far, I felt like the story here really dragged. I mean, there were so many points where you would just get like an hour block of cutscenes with like maybe a couple fight sequences like here and there, but it's like just mostly just story exposition based cutscenes, and it was just so slow to me. And I just found it such a boring way to be telling this story here, especially because, as I said, like this is the repetitive structure that this game does over and over and over again. However, unlike the other 2 games that we'll be talking about, this game does focus around 2 characters. We have Kiryu, who is the main protagonist of the entire series up until Yakuza 6. But in this game, I found him to be much less of a focused character, despite him having some plot threads that did reconnect to future games in the series, like his relationship with Nishikiyama. But I really felt like the star of the show in this game was Majima, who in the other games, we see him as a comic relief style character. But in Yakuza 0 here, he's a much more serious character. And this game does show how he develops into the character that we see from the main series. Though I will say for me that I always found this character development to be kind of ridiculous, as the events that happen to him don't really correlate with this development. It's kind of just this like throwaway thing that's throughout the game. As for the main plot, it does revolve around the empty lot, this location of a murder that Kiryu ends up getting framed for. And I have a couple of things to say about this. First, how many times does Kiryu have to get framed or blamed for a murder that he didn't commit? It's kind of ridiculous that we start this game with that happening to him when obviously the beginning of the series as a whole, like the beginning of Yakuza 1, is him also taking the blame for a murder he didn't do. But also, I never fully understood what the point of the empty lot was. Like, I get that these gangs want it, that they want the deed to this location. I never fully understood why. And for me, that's a fault of the storytelling. I just feel like, again, this story is just so bloated that makes it very hard to dissect like what's important and what isn't. But whatever, I mean, Kiryu does end up spending most of the game trying to clear his name for the murder, while Majima's storyline focuses on him protecting this blind woman named Makoto, who is the owner of the empty lot. And he eventually falls in love with her and blah, blah, blah. I mean, the story is told in a way where every 2 chapters we do change characters, and some plot points from one character's storyline might carry over into the other one, particularly towards the end of the game where Makoto does get introduced into Kiryu's storyline. And for me, it was this entire endgame of the story that really started to interest me narratively. Pretty much at the point where Tachibana surrenders and ends up getting killed is where I started to enjoy the story, as again, I thought those were some really great scenes. I really liked the scenes between Majima and Makoto towards the end game, and their farewell was a really emotional one, though again, a bit generic at that. In retrospect, I really enjoyed the scenes between Kiryu and Nishiki, obviously now knowing the full context of their relationship that we see during the first game. So I did end up enjoying the story by the end of it, but I felt like the game itself is just too long for its own good. Again, I feel like it's a massively bloated game with so much story that really doesn't matter. I feel like this game could have easily been condensed into a 10-15 hour experience instead of the 30-hour experience that it is. And as I said, I mean, gameplay wise, I felt like the end game was getting super repetitive, which is going through the same structure over and over and over again. So while everyone seems to love Yakuza 0, I will admit I personally came out of this experience pretty lukewarm on it and on the series as a whole, and was really just unsure if I wanted to continue with it. But that now takes us to Yakuza Kiwami, the remake of the original Yakuza game, using the engine of Yakuza 0. And straight up, this game pretty much feels like Yakuza 0, but with a different story. I mean, you can clearly tell that this was developed in a very short time span, where they just reused a whole bunch of assets. And if I remember correctly, I mean, the hardcore Yakuza fan base doesn't seem to love Kiwami, as it is a largely dumbed down experience with pretty mediocre side content. But I will say that I did enjoy this experience with Kiwami, definitely more so than my experience with 0. Now again, I'm not saying 0 is not the better game. I do think it's probably more well made. Again, gameplay wise, there isn't much different from Kiwami to 0. The open world in the game is exactly the same. The 4-style combat system is still exactly the same. It returns. And I mostly played this game very similarly to how I played 0. I mean, the upgrade system is different from 0, where we do use the more traditional experience points to buy upgrades. But again, just like 0, the combat does get repetitive after a while. A nice quality of life adjustment here was the ability to save at any given point. I mean, something I hated about Yakuza 0 was how you could only save at phone booths. But here in this game, you can save from anywhere in the open world. Again, obviously a lot more convenient. But then we get to the narrative, and this is what I personally really enjoyed more than 0. Again, I think 0's narrative is definitely a lot more complex, while Kiwami's here is probably a lot more generic. But I found it a lot more enjoyable. I never felt like the game dragged for me as I did with 0. I felt like the pacing of the scenes were a bit more in line. I didn't feel like there were nearly as much filler. I felt like more of the plot points were more memorable to me. To be honest, I don't really have that great of a memory of what happens for a good chunk of 0, as a good chunk of 0 just bored me to death. But Kiwami here, I think, has a great premise in Kiryu deciding to protect Nishiki and take blame for the murder that he did, and him getting out of jail 10 years later to find out that everything had changed. Again, this is generic, but I do like the opening here, and I like how it allows for Kiryu to learn information just as the player does, where he learns that Nishiki has become this ruthless crime boss, and his friend Yumi has gone missing, and you do see a lot of similar themes in this game to what we saw from 0, though obviously that's more of an indication of 0 taking themes from the original Yakuza than it is this taking themes from Yakuza 0, but still. You do have to deal with the inner conflict within the Tojo clan and have to protect Haruka, a girl who everybody in the game seems to be after. I mean, again, a similar role that Makoto had in 0, and I really did like the relationship between Kiryu and Haruka. Obviously, it is, again, this very generic parent-child-esque relationship that we see throughout media. I mean, so many games at this point use this formula. I mean, The Last of Us, God of War, The Witcher, The Walking Dead. I mean, all these games have these parent-child relationships, though I do actually find it interesting that Yakuza was the first one of these mentioned that did it in video game form. Though obviously Yakuza as a whole isn't as focused on this relationship as those other games are, where these other games mostly rely on those relationships, while Kiryu and Haruka's relationship kind of feels more like a side piece to the story. Now, from what I understand, the Kiwami remake here does include more content for the characters of Nishiki and Majima, and I really do like how their characters are handled here. Majima gets most of his content in this game from him trying to get Kiryu to fight him, and while Nishikiyama gets more background in his cutscenes, showing how brutal he's become over time, and I did really like that. I did also like the inclusion of Date, let's go with Date, as a character for this game, as it again feels like this generic best friend or partner character for Kiryu to bond with throughout the series, but I did like how this game started their bond. Now, this game's story wasn't nearly as twist-heavy as Yakuza 0's was, but I did really like the mystery of learning about Yumi's whereabouts and her connection to Haruka and the missing 10 billion yen, and while the endgame of this game was really over the top, I did find it a lot of fun. We do have Kiryu facing off against Jingu, who really just comes off as this really ridiculously maniacal villain at the end. And I like how we had the true final showdown between Kiryu and Nishikiyama, and that was really great. I did really love how the story concluded, where Kiryu was able to put the Yakuza life behind him and adopt Haruka, which felt like a perfect ending to this story. And to be honest, I would have been perfectly fine if this was the only game in the series. If this had been the only story that this series got to tell, I would have been very satisfied. I do think this one entry just feels like an individual story. It doesn't need any additional context or continuation. It really just makes 0, to me personally, feel even more pointless, as I don't feel like 0 is a necessary inclusion to the series. It just feels like something that they did just to make a prequel. And again, I feel like you can easily make the argument that all the sequels were unnecessary as well, though obviously we did get a number of them, and we're going to be talking about the next one right now. And with that, let's talk about Kiwami 2, which was a remake of Yakuza 2, and this will be the final game I talk about for this video, but it uses the engine used for Yakuza 6, and right off the bat, I did feel like graphically this was a massive improvement upon the previous games. Probably one of the bigger changes in this game gameplay-wise is the combat system, which I really like the 4-style combat system that was in Yakuza 0 and Kiwami. In this game, they minimalized it back to 1 style. And while that 1 style is definitely more complex than any of the individual styles from Yakuza 0 or Kiwami, I did feel like this was a bit of a downgrade. I did kind of like the new progression system in this game, where there are 5 different types of tokens that you could get, and each one of them applied to a different type of upgrade, and you really had to manage how you were using each of these tokens for certain upgrades, and I did like it as a whole, though again, it's not that major of a change. But now for the narrative, and with it, let's talk about probably one of my biggest complaints about Kiwami 2, and that is the amount of filler within the main story. I mean, for me, there are just so many points where the game forces you to do activities that really just feel like side content. Or really, like, there's points where the game sends you on this, like, wild goose chase around the city for, like, no real reason. I really don't love the pacing of this game, especially in comparison to the first Kiwami, which I felt like was a very well-told, streamlined narrative. But as a general story, I do think this was a satisfying continuation of the first game. While again, I don't think it was necessary, I don't think this needed to exist, I do think it does a pretty good job at furthering the story of Kiryu, with him being forced out of retirement after the assassination of the Tojo clan chairman Terada, and him having to broker peace between the Tojo clan and the Omi alliance. We do get introduced to Daigo Dojima, who kind of comes off as pathetic in this game. With him supposed to be becoming the new chairman, like, we have to rescue him multiple times throughout this game, so I don't know how good of a sign that really is. But we do also get introduced to Ryuji Goda, who I really liked as a rival figure for Kiryu, and I do think he was a fitting successor to Nishiki in his role from the previous game. We do also get introduced to Sayama, who becomes Kiryu's love interest, and she was fine. I mean, I felt like her interactions with Kiryu and her arc with him were kind of typical of what you would expect. Again, she was pretty cold to him early on, bonds with him throughout the game, they end the game in love, pretty standard stuff. I will say that at first I was pretty disappointed with the lack of Kiryu and Haruka stuff within this game. Again, I really enjoyed their relationship in the first game. However, in this game, she really only appears at the very beginning of the game and then disappears for a decent amount of time. But towards the end game, she does get kidnapped, and then she ends up playing a much bigger role from that point forward. Date and Majima have smaller roles in this game than they did in the first one, even though Majima's might actually probably be more important to the overall story. But I do think they still have their moments. I do feel like plot-wise, this is definitely more of a plot twist-heavy narrative than the first game, where, I mean, we might as well talk about the final chapter right now. It's the most ridiculous ending to a game I have ever seen, where we just get twist after twist after twist, and it's like, I just found like everything that happens from the final chapter on is just so ridiculous. But the first twist to come up was that Goda and Sayama turn out to be half siblings, which felt really forced to me. I did pick up on the foreshadowing earlier on where both of them talked about how they never knew their real parents. So again, not surprising that they end up being related to some degree. But I did find it really forced how, like, towards the end of the game, they're really trying to make us feel like they actually cared for each other when it's like, I mean, they just met. So for me, that didn't really feel earned at all. And we get to the first fight of the finale where we're fighting against Goda, and I was thinking, this has got to be the end, right? I mean, like, this is the final fight in the game. It has to be. I mean, like, they're on the cover. I mean, it just makes all the sense in the world for this to be the final fight in the game. But nope, we get a plot twist. Guess what? Terada's still alive. You know, that guy that we saw get shot and killed at the beginning of the game? It turns out he faked his death in order to lure Kiryu out, and had actually been the leader of the Jingwan Mafia this entire time. I just felt like this was so ridiculous. But I would have been content if this was the end of the game. Again, like, really out of nowhere, just plot twist, but if this was the end, fine. But guess what? We get another plot twist. Turns out Takashima is the real bad guy here, and that Terada, before he dies, reveals he has a hidden bomb that's set to explode. And we have to defeat Takashima in time, and once we do, again, you would think, this is the end of the game. We had 3 final bosses and all of them are dead. All we need to do is escape and then we're home free. But nope, guess what? Ryuji's still alive, and we have to fight Ryuji again, despite them being on this tower that's about to explode. And that's when we have the actual final fight in the game. Again, this second fight with Ryuji is the final fight, but all of this felt so ridiculous to me. Though, again, I felt like having the final fight be with Ryuji felt right. Like, it had to be that way, considering how much he was propped up to be this new rival for Kiryu in this game. But again, the circumstances are ridiculous. But after the fight, Kiryu and Sayama now have no time to get off the tower, obviously because they wasted it all fighting Ryuji, and we get to see the bomb's timer reach 0, and we cut to credits. And I literally just laughed. Like, I thought this was so dumb. Like, the fact that we're ending on this cliffhanger of Kiryu and Sayama are probably dead, which was such a ridiculous ending to me because, like, obviously I knew that there were 4 other games in the main series. So it's like, obviously he survives. Obviously there is a Yakuza 3 where he is the main character. So I was thinking, okay, we're going to have to wait until next game to see what happens. But nope, we get a post-credit scene where through dialogue we just find out the bomb was fake. for some reason. Again, how convenient. I mean, again, this was foreshadowed technically with the police having confiscated all the bombs and Kiryu being surprised when he saw, oh my god, there's still another bomb. But again, I really didn't like how they handled this plot twist. Though again, the game ends the way I expected it to, with Kiryu and Sayama now being a couple and spending time with Haruka. Again, pretty standard stuff. Though again, the road to the end here, that final chapter, is so ridiculous, but it's humorous. Like, I mean, I had fun. It was an enjoyable experience, but it was definitely not the most well-written affair. But that's pretty much the main story. But before we end this video, I still got to talk about the Majima Saga, which was a Kiwami 2 exclusive story where we get to play as Majima, and this connects the stories of Yakuza 1 and 2 while also bringing in elements of Yakuza 0 as well. And for the most part, I did find this to be pretty memorable outside of obviously seeing Makoto again and seeing Majima interact with her now 18 years later. I think that was nice. Again, a nice callback to something that was obviously a retcon at the time. And it was also nice to see Majima returned to the Cabaret Grand, which is where he worked in Yakuza 0 again. There were nice callbacks here, but outside of those things, I do feel like this was a pretty forgettable section. But as for Kiwami 2 as a whole, I do think this is the better overall product than Kiwami. I do think the side content was more interesting. I do think the open world was a lot more interesting to see, obviously with this being a newer engine, more modern visuals, and quality of life changes that were made from the original Kiwami. But I will say that, again, the story of this game is just so ridiculous, and it's probably the least focused out of the 3 games I've played so far. But at the end of the day, I mean, at least it was memorable. I mean, no matter how ridiculous I found the ending, it's something that is going to stick to my mind for a while. It's obviously really ridiculous, but like whenever I think of Yakuza now, one of the first things I think of is that ending stretch of Kiwami 2. And I will say that I did like how they continued off of the story of Yakuza 1. And I did leave my experience with Kiwami 2 having a decently high opinion of it, despite it having some pretty obvious shortcomings. But that's the video. I mean, those are my thoughts on Yakuza 0, Kiwami, and Kiwami 2. As I mentioned earlier, I do plan on continuing on with this series. And the plan as of right now is to make the next video include the games that were included within the Yakuza Remastered Collection on PS4, which are Yakuzas 3, 4, and 5. And then in the final video, I plan on including Yakuza 6, along with the PS4 spin-offs in Judgment and Fists of the North Star Lost Paradise. Now, I haven't fully decided what I'm going to be doing with Yakuza Like a Dragon. I might end up including it in that final video, or I might include it in a separate video on its own. I'm not 100% on that as of right now, but once all those games are covered, I will be doing a series ranking to wrap this all up. Stay tuned for that down the road, but for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.